Sydney, Siberia. I'm making this recording because, as you probably know, Flash has met its demise. And so I'm making a version that other people can at least see. An experience in what would you call that? Sort of a secondary way, I suppose. There is no sound in this work, so if you don't want to listen to my annoying voice, well, just turn off the sound and watch what the work does. All right, so this is Sydney, Siberia. This is you could call it a recombinatory interactive digital poem. It's comprised of quite a few tiles of poetic elements written and drawn over pictures of Newcastle, Australia. So in case you don't know, I made this work as part of a residency I did at an arts organization at the time called The Lockup, which was an old police station that had a bunch of jails and other things, and also had an apartment that artists could stay in. So I was there for about 3 weeks and walked around and seemed to, find all sorts of interesting, weird images that seemed to inspire poetic elements. And so I thought, well, okay, I have all these different images I've taken over these long walks through Newcastle, Australia. How can I transform these into some sort of experience that allows people to continuously explore? In many ways, I want this to replicate or emulate a walk, sort of a meandering lost walk where you just wander into stores, you wander down roads, you have no particular direction. Instead, you're just exploring. And that's very much what I was hoping to do with this work. The title actually comes from a book. It's an old history book that's not well known at all. It's almost like a pamphlet even. It was a historian who was comparing Newcastle to Siberia, and hence the title Sydney's Siberia. So Sydney's Siberia is very much what Newcastle is known as. So it's not any great mystery in terms of this work's about Newcastle, Australia, and the title comes from an old historical pamphlet about Newcastle, Australia. I guess the reference is that Newcastle is about 2 hours outside of Sydney. And so in some ways, if you're banished to Siberia in Russia, or maybe they were talking about the Soviet Union, in a similar way, you might be banished from Sydney and sent to Newcastle. All right, so that's the history of the work. This interface actually has been used in quite a lot of different iterations. In fact, I might even take you through those, possibly. Yeah. I'll see if I can actually, once this is done, I'll make another video and I can take you through a bunch of different iterations using this same interface. I use this same interface in about 8 different works. Some of them were art commissions, some of them were things I just did as a community service or as a way of engaging with communities that were having a great difficulty. And I found the interface was quite engaging for people. And so I continue to use this for multiple works. Since this is no longer functioning in a web sort of way, I can tell you how it works. I usually keep this bit secret, but I can just tell you now. So as we go through it, you'll notice that there is this aha moment, or not aha. There's this kind of beautiful moment that I find very unexpected. So if we just start here, let's say this is the first page, right? We go in, we choose a spot. Okay, we can see it's starting to create a sort of mosaic. And I zoom in a bit more, kind of lost it now. And so, okay, fine, we'll click on this image. To me, it's this moment here. So I've already gone through one cycle. I click on this and it's mosaic again. Now, I find that's fascinating because this does this infinitely. And so the question is, how the heck does it do this? Well, what it does is very briefly, there's a brief pause, which you can't even really see there because this is local, but you'd see it on the net. And it's basically each of these images is given a color value. So in many ways, this work functions better in terms of the mosaic aspect if it has more images of various colors, color dominance. So this is very green, this is very orange, this is very purple, whatever. And they're each given hexadecimal color value. And then when you get to this point here, it's basically analyzing the images for relatively basic chunks of color. So here's a bit of a pink color and there's a dark green color. And so it's gone through and it's identified, okay, well, these are all the pink images. We'll shove them in there. These are vaguely green, so we'll put them in here. And these are obviously sort of gray or ivory, I guess. And so we'll shove those images into there. And it's building these mosaics basically based on that. It's already analyzed pretty much all of them because I just run it through a bit of ActionScript when I build this thing. So it already kind of knows beforehand. So it's a bit of trickery. It's not, it understands how to chop up each of the images. But I think it does it really well, given the fact that, you don't have any idea where people are going to click when you get to a specific image. So, yeah, sure, here's an image, comes up, that's fine. But then you have no idea where a person's going to click in here. So it has to do it dynamically, which again, I find amazing. And I have not been able to replicate this in a JavaScript or any other way in Unity or whatever. So in many ways, this is kind of like a lost, beautiful thing that I'm sharing with you now. These poetic tiles, I think, are worth to read. I loved writing these things and spent a lot of time thinking about the images I would take. Each of them, generally the theme of the images and the focus of the poetry in these images is taking off this idea of abandoned, lost places. These are places that have beauty, have interest, have a narrative inside of them, that you can look at them and you can see this kind of story that's happening just based on the image itself. So I'm doing what's called reading the landscape. I used to be a cultural geographer, still am in some ways. I did a bachelor's and a master's in cultural geography at the University of Oklahoma, and then worked as a regional city planner for a while in central Oklahoma at various places. And so I learned very early about how to read the landscape, how to understand what you see and try to see a narrative there. And so very much this is what this is doing. So very much, each of these different tiles is taking off of what's on the image very specifically and trying to read it. So I'll give you an example. Torque is a twisting force and hinges adores with halved. Halved, I sound like an Australian. Let's try that again. Torque is a twisting force and hinges adores with halved are only meant for dominant opening acts. Those so frantic to breach is to need. What does that mean? Well, hinges, old rusty hinges, to me are fascinating, but what's particularly interesting is the fact that they're so giant. These are giant hinges for what is a very small door. And I find, well, why would someone need this? Why would someone want to add these giant rusty hinges with a considerable number of screws and strength into this door that in many ways is kind of falling apart with a crazy sort of, wooden frame that isn't quite square. And so, what is behind there? Or what indeed are they trying to protect? What are they trying to keep from coming out or going in? And so that's an example. I'm trying to read the situation. I'm trying to sort of understand what's happening there. Let's go to another one. This is just a door. It's a horrible out of focus photo, which I intentionally did. I mean, if you're going to replicate a walk, you have to have some out of focus photos. At least I think. And so I read this. It says, it wasn't the blue and friction rust chain discouraging the vines from fully evolving to green, a pace so quick the lens loses sight of the immediate fore. Two things going on there. Obviously, one is the first part is referencing the fact that you have these vines that are overcoming this blue door that's chained shut, this blue gate that's chained shut. Looked like actually the blue gate had not been open for a very long time, that someone had decided to paint a gate blue, drawing tension into it, but is just a gate that never opens. And so the vines are struggling to get around it, but they are. Eventually they'll overcome the door. And then the second part of that is playing off the fact that I just took this as walking by and it's quite out of focus. And then, of course, you have the drawing bits, which are drawing attention to different elements on the photos. Let's go through a few more. How about this one? Oh, whoa. Huh. This references city planning. I forgot about that. Wow, it's crazy. City planners continue to be suspicious of growing a concrete cactus from a temporary pavilion. So this is very straightforward, right? Temporary pavilion. This is a giant cactus building. Yeah, that's obvious. But still, I don't know, maybe not the best one, but I like the image. And there's an added element to this. So there's not just the image and reading the image and writing the poetry and navigating through the interface and these kind of mosaics continually coming up. But there's also this element here of these are all sort of visual artworks. Not sort of visual artworks, they just are visual artworks. So very much the color of the fonts and the drawing, the framing of the image, all that is an element that I built into it. It's all intentional. Well, for the most part, intentional. It's never completely intentional, is it? You'll notice, for example, a bit of dithering on this image. That was done because there are quite a few images on here, so there's always this kind of weird compromise that someone makes in making this kind of work where you're having to reduce image quality to basically to allow for a quicker download time for whoever's exploring the work. That is infinitely annoying because, of course, when this was built, which was now about 10 years ago, the internet speeds weren't quite what they are these days. So because of that, it was more of a consideration than I think it would be now. I think I'd be able to have a much higher quality image than I did, but such is what happens. Oh, wait. There are bits of detail in here. I'll read through this one, then I'm going to explain something else. With the mild winter running close, some kind other, worried for the cold hands of warning lights, graciously left gardening gloves, still stained from lands other than concrete. Guard the wall, guard the wall, guard the precious, precious wall. All right. Two elements here. One is obviously playing off the fact that these strange gardening gloves are hanging off of what's a warning light. And, personifying, I guess, the warning light in some ways that someone might have come by in a very absurd way said, this warning light needs gloves. I shall leave gloves for this warning light. And this second element, most of these tiles that have two poetic bits, they're referencing two different things on the images usually, not the same thing. So one is the gloves. The second one is the fact that this warning light and this warning plank, is that a warning plank? A warning plank. It's just against a wall, And, obviously they probably just put it there as a place to store it. But it just looked kind of funny to me. It looked kind of interesting that someone would so very much need to guard this wall. All right. Now, what I was going to say was there's multiple levels of reading this. One is, of course, an up-close reading where you go through and you read those individual tiles. But another one is kind of a disfocus. So this, in a way, becomes like a collection of poems. This is very much a visual collection of poems at this point. And then as a reader, you're scanning it, right? You're scanning it through and you're saying, well, I've seen that one. And I've seen this one over here, and I've seen this one. What else can I explore? What are some I haven't read yet? And so you might go through here and say, okay, well, I've seen the Hinges one, but here's an interesting one. And so at this point, for example, you're starting to actually be able to read it. You're starting to be able to see the fact that this is a collection of poems, and these all have connections between each other. So every time you go through this work, you're seeing different connections between them. I personally love that, but yeah. There's a lot of images on here, things tied together via chains or via hinges or ropes, or this is some sort of elastic thing. That's interesting. Huh, I didn't notice that. Oh well. A birth or creation or manufacturing date resolve a violent and vein boiling dispute between the makers of aluminum and steel. These two, the bench and the barrier sign, were promised to marry, tied together against the coastal winds. So odd that these two things would be tied together in such a way. The drawing kind of highlights that tied together against the coastal winds, which you can't see off image, off screen, off to the sides, the fact that this is right next to the ocean. Newcastle is a city like all of Australia's cities almost, which is a city that's up against the ocean. Australia is, for the most part, huddled against the ocean in terms of its population. And so, yeah, that's what that's about. Now, some of these come up over and over again, and I why is that? Well, I think it's because that generally there are biases inside this work. The biases aren't thematic or they're not based on any sort of content. The biases are just simply based on the color value that is given to that image. And indeed, this has been run through before putting it together. So the color values are kind of predetermined to some extent. Although not completely, by the way, but generally each of the images is given a color value before you even open it. And because of that, each time you run it through to determine the color values, it could change. And indeed, I've kind of messed with the code. There are versions that I've never shown anyone. They're just completely crazy because I've gone through and I've randomly changed the color values. And it just it loses the mosaic sense. And it just becomes this kind of random thing that I didn't find nearly as compelling. But because of the color value issue, some of these images come up a lot, and some of them are rare. I had a student one time say, this is like, and this is recent actually, a few years ago, this is like Pokemon Go. You've got the regular ones that occur all the time, and then you have the ultra rare ones that you find. And I like that. I thought that was nice. In many ways, it's a compliment because I've tried to replicate a walk. I've tried to replicate a journey, and I guess that's been successful. The gravely injured cart is not pretending to be gravely injured. The bench, however, is a liar. I'm insane. Yeah, I like this one. This is funny because it's funny. All right. So unfortunately, well, okay. So if you want to play this work yourself and you want to experience it and read it, you can. I will put the file up somewhere. You can email me. My email is jason@dpoetry.com. That's D as in dungeon, poetry.com. dpoetry.com. So jason@dpoetry.com. And if you email me, I'll send you the files. And all you need is a local Flash player. There are a lot of Flash players out there. One suggestion, though, is to look at it with your internet turned off. Otherwise, Adobe will try to get into your little Flash player and kill it. So, yeah, that's annoying, isn't it? All right, so this is the work. I can go through a few more, and then I'll let you go. Shortly after the first citywide safety regulations, there was a fence war between steel manufacturers. By the way, Newcastle's a steel town in some ways, a manufacturing town. Shortly after the first citywide safety regulations, there was a fence war between steel manufacturers, with millions to be made installing safety fences. The competing firms waged war through intimidation, sabotage, and indirect killings. The results are long rows of disjointed iron fences, incomplete railings, and weakened bars that continue harming today. This is actually kind of an interesting one in the sense that, all the rest of them, not all the rest, but the majority of the poetry tiles on this work are that poetry. And this is a bit of little fiction and almost reads like nonfiction, not even creative nonfiction, but just like nonfiction. It's almost reads, it's kind of boring, actually. The narrative itself is kind of interesting, but the language level is kind of dull. Yeah, that's kind of a deviation, isn't it? Huh. Haven't thought about that, to be honest. When you're writing this many tiles, you're likely to have deviations to the overall focus. I'm not that worried about that kind of thing. I know some writers and artists are. I am not. The more mess, the more deviation, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Embarrassed by this castled section of the atmosphere, the sun banned its rays and radiation from ever reaching this space. Even the moon and its bounced and mirrored glow cannot find this dark spot. Priests, jailers, and yoga gurus have used this spot punishment and therapy. That's missing a word. Should be for. Use this spot for punishment therapy. That's annoying. Bad me for missing something. What is this? Oh, by the way, this is a little funny thing here. That's me. So right there, that's me. You can tell by my stupid hair. The still room was, for 9 hours, the only cure for reflecting traffic and light and lit bars, 1/3 a poet aside. So 1/3 a poet aside. There he is. That is me. I think I appear a couple times in here in shadow, which was unintentional, but obviously intentionally written about. I have a fascination, by the way, with products in grocery stores. I find it really interesting and horrible at the same time. Moving away from strange tales and odd poetics, I myself, the artist, the poet, the coder, have an odd attraction to toothbrushes, their ever-changing features, and curving colored bristles. I really do, actually. I find it fascinating how toothbrushes are always saying that they're better than the previous toothbrush, and they've done that ever since I was a child. And I just think by now, toothbrushes should cure all ills and allow us to live into the hundreds and hundreds of years because, they've had enough time. They've done enough toothbrushes. They've done an amazing job of improving every single new toothbrush. Incredible. All right, I'll do 2 more. In the 1930s, sky ships docked here while transporting spools of root wood from the hill pines, the fibers used for religious binding and Christmas tree ornaments. One of the blimps wind tore away, leaving an anchor too heavy for manual means. Oh, that's kind of pretty, actually. No climbing on anchor. No limbing on quar. So yeah, you really do end up sort of looking around and trying to find bits and pieces that you haven't seen. Oh, there's one I haven't seen in a while. The heat required to burn a stone block building is enough to move all those heavy red ships like teeth on the water's sky heavy contour. Oh, that's pretty. Yeah, there's a lot of burns section of Newcastle where people sort of were lighting things on fire that normally wouldn't burn. I found that kind of interesting. It wasn't like a wide scale thing where people were trying to burn down houses. They were just lighting small fires against walls and stone stone bits and steel things. A printing error coupled nestled with a paper manufacturing difficulty resulted in every issue of popular home magazines becoming bulletproof and used in dangerously guarded windows. Yeah, there was back when magazines were a thing 10 years ago, actual paper magazines, you'd see all these walls of shops and they just have tons of magazines there. I took a lot of pictures of like door handles and things. Interesting. Far too many diagrams were drawn, test groups studied, and engineers consulted for the creation of this handle and its steel surrounds. A far less expensive option is to help those outside the fence to be happy outside the fence, or to fill the inside with giant acid dipped bees. All right, I promise this is the last one. The bridge into the ocean was never finished and ends where the weather begins to churn and waves are more movement than crash. This has been Sydney, Siberia. Uh, Again, if you want the files, email me at jason@dpoetry.com. That's my email address, jason@dpoetry.com. And I'll send you the files. Happy to do it. Thank you very much for exploring this. I hope that you've learned something about it, listening to me go on and on and on, because it is, after all, a conversation with removal and rebar. Cheers.